Hey friends, it's Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, on this episode, I want to just take a few minutes briefly just to touch on this issue of the United States in partnership with England and France lobbing some missiles into Syria. This just happened overnight, and as you can imagine, I've got quite a few emails in my inbox and people asking, Joel, what is the prophetic significance, and does this have any biblical relevance and this sort of thing? So that is going to be the subject of this episode. Before we do that, I want to just give a brief ministry update, touch on a few different things. First of all, as some of you know, but many of you don't know, our ministry partner, FAI, that's Frontier Alliance International, in partnership with Pilgrim Media, has just officially released the third film in the series Covenant and Controversy. Now listen, if you have not seen any of these films yet, then you have to get caught up, quite simply. Covenant and Controversy is a 5-part film series that has been put together again by FAI, Frontier Alliance International, in partnership with Pilgrim Media. This is Dalton Thomas, Stephanie Quick, just a whole great team. And it deals with the issue of the Lord's covenants, of God's covenants with his people Israel, and of course the multiple-pronged controversy that has come as a result of this. And this really is one of the most critical, central, arching narratives within the Bible. And as followers of Jesus, as students of the Bible, we need to understand this issue. It really is one of the primary keys that unlocks understanding concerning what's unfolding in the earth right now. Why all of this anti-Semitism? Why all of this rage? Why all of this geopolitical pull back to the Middle East? What is this all about? And so the way that we've been going about doing this, by the way, is, we make these films on our own dime. Everyone in these films is paying for their own plane tickets. And there's a lot involved in making documentaries, traveling all over the world and so forth. And these are really cinematically beautiful, artistic pieces as well. So there's a lot that goes into these. These aren't just sort of thrown together documentaries. But once the film is created, we put it on Vimeo on demand, which means you can pay for it, you can buy it, and then you can stream it or download it. And when you do that, you get all kinds of bonus footage. You actually get more footage than is in the film itself, a whole bunch of extra interviews and outtakes and so forth, and you own that forever. However, if you're not interested in all the bonus footage, after just a brief season of putting it out on Vimeo on demand, and why do we do that? Well, we're just trying to recoup some of the production costs. Again, it doesn't even begin to recoup the production costs, but just some of it. But after just a few weeks, we put it out there for free. We put the films out there for free, and we want everyone to watch these. This is FAI's gift to the body of Christ. Again, this information it's really too sacred even just to own. So the first film was The Great Rage, dealing with the enduring legacy, the historical continuum of rage against the Jewish people. What is this all about? This lays the groundwork, the framework, the foundation for the rest of the film series. Part 2 is The City of the Great King, dealing with the centrality of Jerusalem, Zion, within this unfolding promised plan of redemption, this covenantal framework that God is effecting and carrying out down throughout history. Why Jerusalem? And it deals with the history and the future of Jerusalem. It's, again, a cinematically beautiful and theologically beautiful film. Part 3 is probably the most difficult and painful of all of the series, but yet it's at the center for a reason, and this is the great trouble. So we're dealing with the issue of Jacob's trouble, the future time of Jacob's trouble that is actually such a central theme throughout the Scriptures. And this is, as I've said before, death is the elephant in the room of life, which is to say that death is this looming reality. We can't escape it. We will all face it. We'll either face the death of our loved ones, our friends, people close to us, and ultimately, if Jesus doesn't return first, we will face death. I mean, this is just this terrifying reality, and it's present for everyone, and yet it's an issue that we very rarely like to talk about. Few people really like to discuss this, and that's understandable. Well, likewise, the issue of Jacob's trouble, the issue of this future time of cataclysmic suffering and trouble for the Jewish people, for the state of Israel, this really is, in my opinion, the theological elephant in the room of the biblical narrative. I mean, this is an inescapable reality. It's terrifying. The ramifications, the implications of it are absolutely dramatic, and yet we hardly ever talk about it. And it's again, one of the most pressing, implicational issues in all of Scripture. So we deal with this, and again, it's just a very important film. Now listen, to watch the film, you're going to go online, you go to Vimeo.com. Vimeo is sort of like the filmmaker's version of YouTube. YouTube, just sort of anyone throws up videos there, and it'll eventually be on YouTube as well. But Vimeo is more geared toward a high-quality filmmaker sort of thing, but people post videos there. So you go to Vimeo.com/Covenant and Controversy. And so once you go there, you'll be at Covenant and Controversy sort of page, their channel, if you will, and you can watch, or you can do the streaming, download Covenant Controversy 1, 2, and 3. If you haven't watched any of them, get caught up. But part 3 has been released, so I want everyone watching that to gather together. And these are films that you can actually watch a couple times. It's in an age when, let me just say this, in an age when everyone is dumbing down their material, simplifying it, sort of the least common denominator, and making their films shorter and shorter and shorter because our attention span is shrinking. These do just the opposite. There's really no compromise. They are intellectually, theologically heavy material. And so this really is these films are for those who are serious about understanding the Scriptures, understanding what's going on in the earth. So you can watch them a couple times, but they're also very good to gather together. If you have a congregation, a church, a synagogue, you name it, gather together, a group, and have a night, because these really should even be watched on the big screen with good sound systems, and just, the quality of the films are that good. Okay, so that's that. On a personal note, again, we are quickly approaching my upcoming ministry trip that I've been talking about forever. Again, I just really want to emphasize the request for prayer. As I've mentioned previously, spiritual warfare is thick. It's genuine. It's very real, and we're praying and fasting and asking the Lord for grace and covering, and He's faithful to do that. But we do covet your prayers as well. So I'll just leave it there, and we'll go ahead and just sort of jump right into this issue. Okay, so last night. Right now is Shabbat. Right now is Saturday. And last night, the United States, again, together with England, with Great Britain, with France, launched an offensive against Bashar al-Assad in Syria, against the Assad regime. Now, first of all, I just have to back up and just say, a lot of people are saying, but did Assad really gas these Syrians, these children, and so forth? Because this was the basis for this attack. And the funny thing is, it's not even so much funny, it's the painful reality of the age that we live in, is that anything that happens in the news, immediately people automatically say it was a false flag, it was, not real, Assad didn't do it, and you hear just a broad range of opinions out there. And listen, that's understandable. I mean, this is the age that we live in. We, the people, feel as though we are never told the truth. We feel as though The access to accurate, truthful information is a job. We need to go to the right little sort of dark corners of the internet to be able to access that and this sort of thing. Now, let me just say this. Again, our ministry partners, FAI, have been in Syria for over the past, it's been the past year. It's been a year. And so, we've been sending our people, Christians, fellow brothers and sisters, the brethren, into Syria. And let me just say this. Our doctors have treated patients that have been affected by chemicals. So first of all, there has been very legitimate chemical warfare used. That's one. Two, we know for a fact that the regime, the Assad regime, has been indiscriminately bombing civilians. So the argument is, it's always set forward. They go, well, no, Assad is a hardened Middle Eastern dictator. He would never do something so stupid that would bring the wrath of the United States on himself and this sort of thing. But in my opinion, and that's always sort of like, well, that's supposed to end all arguments. He would never do that. So clearly this was carried out by the United States or by the Sunnis, because again, Assad is an Alawite and he's primarily at war with the Sunnis. Now, let me just say this real quickly, because in the United States, again, online geopolitical analysis, we often have just a very detached perspective. The Sunni people are a spectrum. They live on a spectrum. You have everything from just your moderate, normal, everyday Sunni Muslims that are, you could even say not very devout. They really just want to live and raise their families and this sort of thing, up to those who are a little bit slightly more militant, up to those who are quite a bit more militant, to those who are actively identifying with Al-Qaeda, or the various, it used to be Jabhat al-Nusra, now they've changed their name, Nusra al-Sham or something like this, to ISIS. Okay, so, from your average, just sort of everyday Sunni Muslim to ISIS, there is a big, big difference. And if anybody says there's not, they don't know the reality on the ground. Again, Muslims are as different as Christians are different, and that says a lot. But they are at war with Assad, and so anytime that Sunnis are attacked, sort of here in the West, we go, well, they're ISIS. And that's really not true. There's really hundreds of different groups in Syria. And look, guys, just to sort of contextualize this, to sort of, walk a mile in another man's moccasins. Think of this. You're a Sunni Muslim. You're born in Syria, you're raised in Syria, and your president, throughout your whole lifetime, taxes the living daylights out of you. And he says, well, the reason that he's taxing you is because he needs all kinds of weapons to protect you from the evil Israelis, the evil Yehudis. Those Israelis want to kill you, and we are going to protect you, and this sort of thing. So they tax the daylights out of you. And then there's protests. It sort of evolves into a civil war. Next thing you know, this president who has taken all your money throughout much of your lifetime for weapons is now using those weapons against you and bombing your villages and killing your family members because you are part of a different sect, because he says that everyone from your sect, the Sunnis, are all ISIS and so forth, right? Look, if someone started blowing up my neighborhood and killing my family, and I'll just be honest with you, even as a Christian with solid convictions concerning violence and all of these things, there is a very solid chance that eventually I would probably join a militia and become pretty militant myself. And so you have a lot of Sunnis that they are part of different militias and different groups, but they hate ISIS. They hate those groups. So, we have to sort of understand the incredible complexity of the reality there in Syria. But nevertheless, Assad has been, in many ways, indiscriminately bombing Sunni villages, killing children, killing families. And again, the doctors with FAI, we've been treating them over the past year and seeing the reality. Assad is an evil, bad guy. Now, again, the other side, Syria is a mess. There are evil, evil people on the Sunni side. So when I look at this, I'm talking in general terms now, people go, well, what do you think about Syria? What should we do militarily? Like, what should Trump do? And this sort of thing. In my opinion, I don't think there are any easy answers. This thing is an absolute mess. Right now, because Assad is aligned with Iran, And again, Iran is incredibly powerful and expanding its power throughout the region. So Iran essentially controls Baghdad for all intents and purposes. They control Iraq. They largely control the Iraqi military. They also control much of Iraq through the Hashd al-Shabi, which in the mainstream media you'll hear them refer to them as the, in English it's the Popular Mobilization Units, but they usually refer to it as Iranian-backed militias. So you'll hear this phrase, the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. Well, that's, again, in Arabic, Hashd al-Shabi, which translates loosely as the Popular Mobilization Units. This is essentially an Iranian militia that is led by Iranian generals, Qasem Soleimani, in Iraq. So for all intents and purposes, Iran basically controls large sections of Iraq. Again, not the Sunni areas, but they have significant military presence throughout Iraq. They also have significant control in Damascus, in Syria, again through Bashar Assad, because although he is an Alawite, and the Alawites are a very unique, specific sect, you could even say there's almost like a cult within Islam, but Assad and his people are Alawites. They are much more aligned with the Shia, in other words, the Iranians. And so Assad is largely a proxy or a puppet of Iran in Syria. And then in Lebanon, you've got Hezbollah. And again, Hezbollah being a puppet upon of Iran. So Iran is incredibly powerful throughout the region, again, working to achieve nuclear weapons, openly have stated their long-term goals of wiping out Israel. So for right now, in this mess that, as Sarah Palin says very flippantly, and I'm not a big fan of this type of sort of flippant approach, but she just says, hey, let's just step back. Let's not do anything. Let Allah sort them out. Like, let the Muslims fight amongst themselves. Let Allah sort them out. In other words, they're both our enemies. The Sunnis, the radical, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so forth, Assad, they're all our enemies. They're all largely bad guys. That's sort of the attitude. And to a degree, that's true. I say that with regard to, should we get American military presence involved? Should we lose American lives? Should we spend billions upon billions of American dollars for a war that we're not really sure who we want to win? And I'm very uncomfortable saying we should get involved in any kind of war. Again, in the past, I've been far more jumpy to get on board, particularly if there's a conservative in office. Then you say, yeah, this war is just, this war is right, it's validated, it's vindicated, we should do this. And this is how conservatives tend to be. And then, of course, whenever there's a Democrat in office, no matter what, it's always bad and this sort of thing. Look, war is always bad. I mean, just period. War is always bad. But there is a time for war, the Bible says. There's a time to deal with evil. Nevertheless, in this situation, I have extreme hesitancy in getting involved. But that said, right now, as the United States, as Israel assesses the situation in the Middle East, they go, we have this incredibly powerful Iran. Yeah, we have groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, but they're much easier to deal with. They don't have nuclear weapons. They are not an entire national military that essentially controls the capitals of at least 3 foreign nations. Again, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, not to mention Yemen through the Houthi rebels. Iran is extending its spidery tentacles throughout the region. They're very powerful. So at the forefront of our larger foreign policy interests in the region, dealing with Iran, by extension Assad, is a good thing. And if he's using chemical weapons against children and families, which, again, all evidence points to him doing this, from the intelligence, from our angle, from Israel's angle, the United States, not to mention France and England and so forth, the evidence does point to Assad. The chemicals are dropped from planes. Okay, ISIS doesn't have planes. This is a kind of a critical point. And I know that you'll see, Alex Jones and all these different guys, they always will infer that it's always pure false flag. Everything is a conspiracy. It's always the exact opposite of what it appears to be in this sort of thing. Sometimes things are what they actually appear to be. And so that said, the United States launched a whole bunch of missiles, quite a few. Russia says that they took them all down. They may have knocked several out, but many of the missiles did hit. And these were very specific targeted strikes at Syrian military bases, primarily, again, where they kept their planes, as well as chemical facilities, allegedly. Again, could there be all kinds of things going on that we don't know? Of course. But for the most part, there was not a whole bunch of civilian casualties. There were some people that were injured, largely in the missiles being knocked down out of the sky. But this is something that I think, for the most part, we can say was probably a good thing. If we are taking away Assad's ability to use chemicals against families, against children. And again, I want to be clear, in talking about the Sunnis and the Alawites and saying none of them are our friends, listen, they're all created in the image of God. And there are many, many Sunnis, and they're just beautiful families. And, it's easy to stand back and have an attitude that says, well, those people, it's okay if they die and this sort of thing. I mean, even as Christians, I hear people express these kind of opinions until those very same Christians sit down with and get to know the families and the mothers and the fathers and the children and actually have religious conversations with them and then go, I disagree with you, but you're actually an honorable person with a beautiful family, and I want to see you come to faith. And then you start praying for them. And so, we have to be so careful. This is sort of a side note, but we have to be so careful in having this sort of just, well, Joel, what does it say in biblical prophecy? And well, I'm a Republican, so I support, Trump. I support everything he did, and it's okay if people die. That sort of just detached, callous attitude. Our primary job as Christians is to pray and cry out for people to be saved out of the fire. And it's not just national security. It's not just killing the bad guys, although, again, there's room for that. But we need to be praying for the Syrian people. The gospel is and always has been for the poor. Jesus said, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel, the good news to the poor. The gospel is for the poor, the hurting, the dying, the destitute, the needy, those who are dying, those who are in darkness. And those are the ones that the Lord's heart is turned toward, and those are the ones whom our heart should be turned toward in prayer. So we need to remember the human element in all of this. Now, that said, listen, I want to be honest with you. Every time some event happens, people always email and they say, Joel, what's your thoughts? What are your thoughts? What's your opinion? What does Bible prophecy say about that? This is such an American sort of question. Just because the United States is involved doesn't mean that it has some incredible biblical relevance. And just because some event happens in the news doesn't mean that it has biblical relevance. We can tie it to some passage. We need to be so careful of doing that. We so often jump the gun. And look, Scripture gives us the big picture. It gives us sort of the big story, but very rarely does it really dig down into specific events. Well, does it say anything somewhere in the Psalms or in Isaiah about missiles being launched at Damascus? And this is one of the big questions people ask, by the way. Well, is this Isaiah 17, is Damascus about to be destroyed? No, that is not what this is. There is no specific prophetic relevance to these things. This was a targeted strike dealing with an ongoing long-term conflict. Okay, so, I just want to say, let's sort of back up a little bit and just say the larger picture of what's unfolding in the Middle East, yes, that has profound biblical relevance. The aligning of the nations, the sort of geopolitical landscape today, it really is lining up in a profound way with the larger picture painted by the biblical prophets. And that's the main issue. That's real. That's not sensationalism. That can be defended in very legitimate ways. But we sort of delegitimize and sort of soil the legitimacy of all of this stuff when we jump the gun and try to make everything prophetic. It's like the boy who cries wolf, and then a lot of people are not interested in the testimony of the biblical prophets. That's a problem. That's a legitimate problem we need to be careful of, and we need to avoid it. And so pastorally, I'm appealing to you to be careful, to express caution. Don't jump on board every sensational claim. Okay, that said, on the other hand, to quote Tevye from The Fiddler on the Roof, there's always, well, on the other hand, I did sort of, as I was looking at this, my mind was sort of tilted towards something. And then, in fact, there was a friend on Twitter who actually said the exact same thing. He goes, this could be a prophetic foreshadow of a particular passage in Daniel 11. And I said, bingo, that's exactly sort of what was going through my mind. So I want to look at that and then sort of just wrap this episode up. Again, as we look at the primary passages in the Old Testament that deal with the coming Antichrist, that deal with the last days. One of the most significant passages is Daniel 11. I mean, this is one of the most detail-rich, specific, clearly eschatological texts in all of the Old Testament. I mean, there are very few prophecies that have as much detail. Now, I'm going to put a link up on the screen to an article that I had put together quite a few years ago now, I mean, probably like 4 or 5 years ago, in which I deal with Daniel 11, because Daniel 11 is also an incredibly controversial chapter, and a lot of different analysts of biblical prophecy have a lot of different opinions. Some people think the entire chapter has end-time significance. Others think that with regard to the Antichrist, it's most of the chapter is historical, but then in the transition between verse 35 and 36, the prophecy starts dealing with Antichrist. I argue that there is a very, very strong case for the Antichrist being in mind from verse 21 forward. And again, it's an interesting way in which it seems to bleed from history into the last days. But clearly the passage does eventually get to the Antichrist. Whether it begins in 21 or 36 is up for debate. Again, you can go back, and there's discussions by C.F. Kyle, Carl Frederick Kyle, who wrote, along with Delitzsch, the commentary on the Old Testament, folks like S.P. Tregelles, Samuel Prideaux Tregelles, some of these guys, these awesome guys writing in the late 1800s, that they work through some of these things in some detail. And ideally, within the next year or so, I'm actually going to publish some material on my opinion on this. I've really been, it'll probably won't be in the next year or so. I've been working very, very, very slowly over the past 10 years on the book of Daniel. And I've gone through some changes, in fact. Mideast Beast, I lay out a lot of my opinion on a lot of the chapters, but eventually I really would like to just have a complete commentary on the book of Daniel. And maybe even before that, I may have a bit more of a detailed study just on Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 and this sort of thing, because these are profound texts. Okay, that said, if in fact, and again, I've got the link up there for this article, so please work through that carefully. I want to start making resources available, not just the video here, but also articles for people to study further. But do work through that. If indeed verses 21 through 35 in chapter 11, Daniel chapter 11, are also talking about the Antichrist, then you have this reference. Now again, those who say it's historical, they say, well, this is dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes. So Antiochus Epiphanes was the 8th king of the Seleucid or the Seleucid dynasty. These were the dynasties that came after the death of Alexander the Great, the Hellenistic dynasties. And then you had, the Seleucid is really in the north. So you're dealing with Turkey, Syria, Iraq, all the way sort of over to Iran. That was the Seleucid or the Seleucid dynasty. Then in the south, the other primary dynasty or kingdom was the Ptolemaic, and this was largely Egypt. So in history, you have this conflict, this ongoing conflict between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And it was under Antiochus Epiphanes that there was sort of some back and forth. Well, guess, of course, who gets caught in the middle? You know, here I am stuck in the middle with you. Again, is Israel. Israel gets caught in the middle. And again, I apologize for ever singing on this program, or ever for that matter. But that said, when we look at verse 30, chapter 11, verse 30, this is a passage that a lot of people say deals with events in history. And there are events in history that shadow what took place here. And so it's talking about sort of Antiochus coming down and having conflict with Ptolemy. Israel gets caught in the middle. But then it says this, beginning in verse 29, at the time appointed, so at the appointed time, dealing with the king of the north. So the leader from the Seleucid area, again, which correlates very much to Syria today, that the whole northern area. It says, at the appointed time he shall return and come into the south, again, south being Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty or kingdom, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and he shall turn back and be enraged, and then take action against the Holy Covenant. So here's what happens. is that ships from Kittim, now some translations say this was Cyprus. These were sort of the early powers that were emerging out of the Roman Empire, of what would eventually become the Romans, as we were sort of transitioning in history from the Hellenists, the Greeks, to the Romans. And so ships came from essentially the east, from Europe, from Rome, and there's a problem, again, historically with Antiochus, and this upsets him, and so then he turns again against Israel. So what a lot of commentaries will say is that these events in history sort of become a foreshadow for the Antichrist. Again, if verses 21 to 35 are all dealing with the Antichrist, and I would argue they are, and just briefly the reason is because when we get to the next verse, in verse 31, what does it say? Forces from him, again it's speaking of the king of the north, shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. They shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. Now, later in chapter 12, the angels are talking, and they specifically quote verse 31. And they go, so when's that going to happen? And they clearly placed it in the context of the final 3.5 years before the return of Jesus. But they are quoting verse 31. So this is one of the primary reasons why there's a very strong argument for all of this referring ultimately to the Antichrist. So again, I know I'm sort of hedging here. If this is talking about the Antichrist, then there's strong evidence that ships from the east, from the west, from Europe, essentially Europe, or you could say the United States, will come against the Antichrist, and it will actually be part of his story unfolding. If that's the case, and again, I think there's strong evidence that this is definitely a prophetic foreshadow at the least, then the events that we just saw of the United States, of France, of England joining together and launching some missiles at Assad right now, sort of you could say Assad in Syria, or you could say Turkey being the king of the north. You know, it doesn't really matter because the Antichrist, in my opinion, has not emerged yet. But it's that sort of part of the world. The Europeans, along with the partnership of the United States, coming against him and launching some missiles. This could be a faint foreshadow of what will take place with the Antichrist. Now, again, what just took place is not this by any means. But the point here is that, as I said, the geopolitical landscape of today is aligning with the geopolitical landscape that was laid out by the biblical prophets. And even just the fact that right now, in our day, Europe is coming against and you know, in a unified way, launching an attack against an evil ruler from the Middle East. This is just evidence that if the Antichrist emerges in the near future, that the same general geopolitical landscape that we have today will likely exist, and that this was all predicted and prophesied thousands of years ago by the biblical prophets. So that's my assessment. Again, much more could be said. I probably talked more than I even intended to. I hope it was helpful. Listen, biblical prophecy is important. We want to be those who peer into it, who talk about these things, who try to understand the signs of the times, but ultimately our mission, our focus is to know Jesus better, is to prepare our hearts to love people more in the last days, is to pray and cry out that the Lord would open the eyes of those who are in darkness to those who are dying, that we would be part of His mission to snatch as many out of the fire, that the Lord would do for them what He's done for us, that they would find the mercy that you and I have received. So we want to primarily be about saving lives, saving souls for eternity, to give to Jesus His inheritance. We don't want to just be analyzing biblical prophecy for the sake of trying to have insight into things that other people might not understand and all that. I understand the fascination, I understand the interest, but we need to remember what our primary mission is. So that's my sort of pastoral final exhortation. I hope this information was helpful. Again, I want to thank you so much for being with us this week. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.